And it basically comes from, there are 7 dictums that dictate the left and 7 for the right. And I think that we can have that if we explore principle number 3, and we'll see that why there is a lot of political turmoil in present day news. And that dictum is that the halves of world history, the kings and queens, and the leaders and those who had totalitarian power were up against the have-nots, the proletariat, the slaves, the worker bees, and they were the downtrodden. And that's the way the world was for the last 5,000 years. And then suddenly that all ended suddenly. And what happened is that there were a couple revolutions that changed everything. And one is the American Revolution, and one is the French Revolution. And these guys, they came up and they revolted and won. One of the first times in all of history that a revolution was successful. There's only been a few. But this was successful, and it did something to the haves that was just terrible for their situation, which was that democracy, voting, they had to convince people, the have-nots, to vote for them. And so now they have to convince. And so the same is true now. Both parties have to convince the people to vote for them. And but there are 2 outlooks, and according to this principle number 3, there are 2 outlooks, and one outlook is that the left will tend to look at an individual's nature and his and what he is like inside, and determine that it's basically negative, that his nature is no good. And it's got a biblical stance to it. We all fall short of the glory of God. So, and they feel that man's nature is no good, and so he needs to be controlled. We'll look at somebody and think he does fall short of the glory of God. He has a negative outlook. He is corrupted. He is bad, but there are points within him that are good, and that has a biblical origins also. Like in Romans 6, Paul says, hey, we're bad, but that doesn't give you permission to be bad. You have to be good. So the conservative will look at somebody and feel that there is some goodness within him, and he'll try to take that goodness, for example, with the left, and they won't like his ideas, but they'll take a look and see where there is some good within those ideas. And they'll try and work with that and compromise and use it to promote laws and regulations and help bring society more to become fluent in being able to produce goods and services, and which we need to do to bring us up from misery and bring us into goodness. So what happens is that you've got one side feels that you're not so good, and the other side says, well, we're gonna find out your ideas that are good, and we'll try and come to a compromise. And that's how politics works. But what happens is that, and that's why, because the one side will look and doesn't want to compromise because you're bad. Your inherent nature is no good, so we don't really want to compromise with you at all. But the other side says, well, there must be some good ideas within what you believe, and we'll try and pick those and work with them. And that's the reason why compromises tend to go little by little to the left. And and if you look at the world governments throughout the world, they tend to move little by little to the left. And so what happens is that when somebody comes in and try and drag it back and to where it was before without compromise, and go back toward original conservative principles such as we have now, you're going to get huge amount of acrimony, argumentation, no will to compromise, because it's being dragged back in one direction. And we've seen that before in history. Look at Ronald Reagan had the same problem. He brought conservatism and he dragged it back. And boy, did the press, it was just like today. It was a very little difference. Times of lesser acrimony was maybe John F. Kennedy, although later on, his subsequent inheritor of his policies, Johnson, did have tremendous acrimony because of the rise of the will of the people to be against the Vietnam War because it was unsuccessful. And so society started to realize that they can't compromise on that point, and they dragged it back. And so the acrimony in that time was as great as anything is today, with all the riots and consternation of really both sides against the Vietnam War, because they were stuck with in promoting the policy of continued war, and people became more conservative and didn't want it anymore. And suddenly Nixon came in, and his policies also were very contentious. And so at that time also there was tremendous political divide. And so that's all due to what I call that dictum number 3. And as far as I can figure out, the haves and the have-nots politically in their minds basically are about 30%. For the Democrats are basically 30% of a hardcore percent of the population, and the conservatives are basically around 30% of the hardcore conservatives. And so they will not be moved by whatever argument you've got. They're staunch supporters of their particular side. But what happens is that, so everybody tries to convince the independent voter in that middle. And those are the ones that decide elections. And those are really the ones that also decide how much contentious arguments are to be made, because those are the ones that have to be convinced to vote for them. And so that's what I believe is how we answer your question about how volatile is the political scene today.
And that's incredible way you just placed it. Let's start with Ronald Reagan. There's a lot to unpack there. Let's start with Ronald Reagan. When he first became president, his own team, Republicans, had extreme concerns about him. And so, and then there was that whole pushback from the left that said he's entirely too right. And then, like you said, there's those middle who said, give the guy a chance. With Donald Trump, it's been squashed. Whether any dissension towards his policy has been squashed. It's been called Trump derangement syndrome. I've called it TSDS, Trump supported derangement syndrome. It's okay to say a guy is wrong. It's
Right.
okay to question a policy. But now we've got this absolute determination that we are going to defend this man no matter what. And so when you talk about how it was before, about how you said generally the compromise leaned towards the left. And over time, like I was saying before, before this, there was a lot of compromise that leaned towards the left. I agree. We grew the New Deal in a big way over the course of the inception of the New Deal till 50 years later. We grew it in a big way. There was always that feeling of, like you said, that 30% extreme conservative who said, it's just gone too far. And every week you went further. And I think where the real inflection period came was with the Affordable Care Act, where we could no longer come to an agreement. We had the power to do it on our own. And that was an issue. That was really where we expanded, meant we created this whole new social program that was probably economically in measure and size bigger than the whole New Deal. And that was the end of it. And then came the idea of a guy that's going to squash the Affordable Care Act no matter what. It's just in his genes. It's maybe his nature to be vindictive. He didn't like Obama or whatever. They were convinced he was a guy that could once and for all squash at least this one big, giant program. And he hasn't been able to. There was enormous protest all across the country because essentially, for the most part, the ACA works. But so then you come to this logic of the compromise is always leaning towards the left. It really was. Ronald Reagan once posted a video many years ago, I think even before he was in politics, he talked about universal health care. He said, don't give the liberals a finger because they'll take a hand and then an arm and then a leg and then they'll take everything. I mean, it was a video that I think they took it down since then, but it was addressing the idea of the Affordable Care Act just being a start. And then comes the issue of why don't we have universal health care? And so it did. He was right. They haven't been able to accomplish it, but so it did. So, how, when you talk about just like you unpacked it, is there any realistic way to believe that we're ever going to get back to a point where there isn't so much dissension amongst each other?
No, because the idea of goodness is inherent within that 30% of each side. And the goodness of the Democrats is control. That's their ultimate goal, is further control of the human species, because they know that the humans need to be controlled because they're inherently bad. And this is the idea of communism, that the population needs to be controlled and needs to be guided because they're inherently bad. And so otherwise you'll get people rising up out of the have-not class and enter into the bourgeois, and suddenly you got rich versus poor, and this needs to be quashed. And so what happened, so totalitarianism